The Premiership of Margaret Thatcher spanned throughout the entire duration of the 1980s in Britain, between early May 1979 and late November 1990. She became Prime Minister after having served as the leader of the Conservative Party since 1975. Domestically, she is best known for her sweeping policies concerning the affairs of the economy, including the privatisation of most nationalised industries. In foreign policy, she fought a war against Argentina, and played a key role with US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in ending the Cold War. The 11-year duration of her 3 terms in office altogether make up the third and most recent premiership to have outlasted a decade from start to finish, following only the ministries of Walpole throughout the 1730s and Pitt the Younger throughout the 1790s. Despite the controversial nature of her politics, Thatcher continues to rank highly among historians, and generally fares well in popular opinion polls. First term. Deflationary strategy. Under the Thatcher government, the taming of inflation displaced high employment as the primary policy objective. As a monetarist, Thatcher started out in her economic policy by increasing interest rates to slow the growth of the money supply and thus lower inflation. She had a preference for indirect taxation over taxes on income, and value-added tax was raised sharply to 15%, with a resultant actual short-term rise in inflation. The fiscal and monetary squeeze, combined with the North Sea oil effect, appreciated the real exchange rate. These moves hit businesses, especially the manufacturing sector, and unemployment exceeded 2 million by the autumn of 1980, up from 1.5 million at the time of Thatcher's election just over a year earlier. Former Prime Minister Edward Heath, who was also Thatcher's predecessor as party leader, was one of the fiercest critics of Thatcher's economic policies, although his verbal attacks on her policies were often seen as a sign of his anger at her for ousting him from the party leadership in 1975. Political commentators harked back to the Heath government's U-turn and speculated that Thatcher would follow suit, but she repudiated this approach at the 1980 Conservative Party conference, telling the party, to those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say, U-turn if you want to, the lady is not for turning. Quote. That she meant what she said was confirmed in the 1981 budget, when, despite concerns expressed in an open letter from 364 leading economists, taxes were increased in the middle of a recession, leading to newspaper headlines the following morning of "How it hurts," a reference to the Chancellor Geoffrey Howe. In 1981, as unemployment soared and the government's popularity plunged, the party chairman, Lord Thornycroft, and 2 cabinet ministers, Lord Carrington and Humphrey Atkins, confronted the Prime Minister and suggested she should resign. According to her advisor, Tim Bell, Margaret just told them to go away. Thatcher's key ally in the party was Home Secretary, and later Deputy Prime Minister, William Whitelaw. His moral authority and support allowed her to resist the internal threat from the Heathite-wets. After the Brixton riot in West London in April 1981, Employment Secretary Norman Tebbane, responding to a suggestion that rioting was caused by unemployment, observed that the unemployment of the 1930s was far worse than that of the 1980s, and that his father's generation never reacted by rioting. I grew up in the 1930s with an unemployed father, Tebbane said. He did not riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he went on looking until he found it. Over 2 million manufacturing jobs were ultimately lost in the recession of 1979 to 81. This labor shedding helped firms deal with long-standing inefficiency from overmanning, enabling the British economy to catch up to the productivity levels of other advanced capitalist countries. The link between the money supply and inflation was proven accurate, and by January 1982, the inflation rate had dropped back to 8.6% from earlier highs of 18%. Interest rates were then allowed to fall. Unemployment continued to rise, passing 3 million by January 1982 and remaining this high until early 1987. However, a bit later suggested that, due to the high number of people claiming unemployment benefit while working, unemployment never reached 3 million. By 1983, manufacturing output had dropped by 30% from 1978. Although economic growth had been re-established the previous year, the productivity turnaround from labor shedding proved to be a one-off, and was not matched by growth in output. The industrial base was so reduced that thereafter the balance of payments in manufactured goods was in deficit. In 1983, Chancellor of the Exchequer Nigel Lawson told the House of Lords Select Committee on Overseas Trade, "There is no adamantine law that says we have to produce as much in the way of manufactures as we consume. If it does turn out that we are relatively more efficient in world terms at providing services than at producing goods, then our national interest lies in a surplus on services and a deficit on goods." Iranian embassy siege. Thatcher's determination to face down political violence was first demonstrated during the 1980 siege of the Iranian embassy in Prince's Gate, London, when for the first time in 70 years the armed forces were authorized to use lethal force on the British mainland. 26 hostages were held by 6 gunmen for 6 days in May, until the siege came to a dramatic end with a successful raid by Shash commandos. Later that day, Thatcher went to congratulate the Shash men involved and sat among them watching the rerun of the attack. The breaking of the siege by the Shash was later celebrated by the public as one of television's greatest moments. The appearance of decisiveness, christened the resolute approach by the Prime Minister herself, became Thatcher's trademark, and a source of her popularity. In the words of one historian, the mood reflected Mrs. Thatcher's Iron Lady stance, her proclaimed intention of laying the Suez Syndrome to rest and again projecting Britain as a great power. Celebration of the Shash was a key component in the popular militarism of the 1980s, fueled by the continuing war against international terrorism and by the Falklands conflict and Gulf War. The storming of the Iranian embassy had shown that Britain could meet terror with counter-terror. Mrs. Thatcher's black-clad terminators would protect us. Commenting on the SAS's action, Social Service Secretary Norman Fowler agreed. Mrs. Thatcher attracted public support because she seemed to be taking action which the public overwhelmingly thought was right but never thought any government would have the nerve to carry out. Northern Ireland. In May 1980, one day before Thatcher was due to meet the Irish Taoiseach, Charles Haughey, to discuss Northern Ireland, she announced in the House of Commons of the United Kingdom that the future of the constitutional affairs of Northern Ireland is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland, this government, this parliament, and no one else. In 1981, a number of Provisional Irish Republican Army and Irish National Liberation Army prisoners in Northern Ireland's Maze prison went on hunger strike to regain the status of political prisoners, which had been revoked 5 years earlier under the preceding Labour government. Bobby Sands, the first of the strikers, was elected as a Member of Parliament for the constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone a few weeks before he died. Thatcher refused to countenance a return to political status for Republican prisoners, famously declaring, "Crime is crime is crime. It is not political." After 9 more men had died, most rights were restored to paramilitary prisoners, but official recognition of the political status was not granted. Thatcher later asserted the outcome was a significant defeat for the IRA. Thatcher also continued the policy of Ulsterisation of the previous Labour government and its Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Roy Mason, believing that the Unionists of Northern Ireland should be at the forefront in combating Irish republicanism. This meant relieving the burden on the mainstream British Army and elevating the role of the Ulster Defence Regiment and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. The Falklands. On the 2nd of April 1982, a ruling military junta in Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, a British crown colony that Argentina had claimed since an 1810 dispute on the British settlement. The following day, Thatcher sent a naval task force to back diplomatic efforts with the threat of the use of force, and if negotiations fail, to recapture the islands and eject the invaders. The conflict escalated from there, evolving into an amphibious and ground combat operation. An opinion poll published prior to the British landing showed 70% support for military action. Argentina surrendered on the 14th of June and the operation was deemed a success despite 258 British casualties. Victory brought a wave of patriotic enthusiasm and increased support for the Thatcher government, with Newsweek declaring, "The Empire Strikes Back." One poll suggested that 84% of the electorate approved of the Prime Minister's handling of the crisis. 1983 general election. The Falklands factor, along with the resumption of economic growth by the end of 1982, bolstered the government's popularity. The Labour Party at this time had split, and there was a new challenge in the SDP Liberal Alliance, formed by an electoral pact between the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party. However, this grouping failed to make its intended breakthrough, despite briefly holding an opinion poll lead. In the June 1983 general election, the Conservatives won 42.4% of the vote, the Labour Party 27.6% and the Alliance 25.4% of the vote. Although the Conservatives' share of the vote had fallen slightly since 1979, Labour's vote had fallen by far more, and in Britain's first past-the-post system, the Conservatives won a landslide victory. Under Margaret Thatcher, the Conservatives now had an overall majority of 144 MPs.